The blood on the classroom floor wasn't from a math equation gone wrong. It was from 17-year-old Braden Cross learning that the weak female teacher he'd been tormenting for weeks was a former Golden Gloves champion who'd been holding back for exactly 47 days. What started as teenage boys humiliating their substitute math teacher in front of 31 witnesses became the most recorded school beatdown in Pinewood High's history and exposed a corruption scandal that would send 3 adults to prison. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why silence isn't protection, it's permission. If you've ever watched injustice happen and wondered when enough becomes enough, this story will hit different. Because sometimes the quiet ones aren't weak. They're just waiting for the right moment to show you who they really are. Victoria Hayes had been counting 47 days of biting her tongue while Braden Cross and his crew turned her classroom into their personal entertainment venue. 47 days of documenting every sneer, every sexist joke, every deliberate disruption that the administration somehow never witnessed. 47 days of keeping her hands in her pockets, hiding the calloused knuckles that told a story she wasn't ready to share. At 29, Victoria looked like every suburban parent's dream of what a math teacher should be. Conservative cardigans that hid her athletic build, sensible flats that concealed her boxer's stance, wire-rimmed glasses that made her appear scholarly rather than dangerous. Her dark brown hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, never revealing the scar above her left ear from the sparring match that had ended her amateur career 3 years ago. The match where she'd nearly killed her opponent with a combination so vicious that she'd walked away from boxing forever, swearing she'd never use her fists in anger again. But Braden Cross didn't know any of that. All he saw was fresh meat. Pinewood High School sat in the heart of affluent Cypress County, Texas, where Friday night football was religion and college scholarships were currency. The student body was 85% white, 12% Hispanic, and 3% other, a demographic breakdown that the school board proudly displayed on their diversity webpage while ignoring the systemic inequalities that those numbers represented. The building itself was a monument to athletic achievement, with trophy cases lining every hallway and photographs of state championship teams covering the walls like wallpaper. Victoria had arrived 6 weeks ago as a long-term substitute for Mrs. Patterson, who'd suffered a convenient nervous breakdown after refusing to inflate certain students' grades. The principal, Dr. Marcus Steinberg, had been clear about expectations during Victoria's orientation. "We maintain very high academic standards here at Pinewood," he'd said, adjusting his tie with practiced authority. "But we also understand that our student-athletes face unique pressures. I trust you'll find ways to support their success." The translation had been crystal clear. Keep the athletes eligible. Keep the boosters happy. Keep your job. Victoria's first hint of trouble had come during her initial AP Calculus class. Braden Cross had walked in like he owned the place, which in many ways he did. At 6'2", with the kind of blonde hair and blue eyes that made modeling scouts salivate. He was Pinewood's golden boy, starting quarterback for 3 years. 4.0 GPA. Mayor's son, and, according to local newspapers, the most recruited high school athlete in Texas history. College scouts filled the stands every Friday night, watching him throw perfect spirals while his father worked the crowd like a politician at a rally. "So you're the new lady teacher," Braden had announced that first day, settling into his back row seat with theatrical authority. "Hope you know more about math than you do about coaching football." The comment had drawn snickers from his crew, Jackson Riley and Mason Wheeler, who flanked him like bodyguards protecting royalty. Victoria had recognized the challenge immediately. In her 15 years of teaching, she'd seen this dance countless times, the alpha male testing boundaries, establishing dominance, seeing how far he could push before consequences appeared. In her previous schools, she'd handled it with firm authority and clear expectations. But Pinewood operated by different rules. "I'm Ms. Hayes," she'd replied calmly, writing her name on the whiteboard with deliberate precision. "And I know enough about calculus to help you understand why your current trajectory might need some adjustment." The mathematical metaphor had sailed over Braden's head, but the implied criticism hadn't. His eyes had narrowed slightly, and Victoria had filed away that reaction for future reference. This wasn't just teenage bravado. This was wounded pride looking for a target. Over the following weeks, the pattern had escalated with mathematical precision. Braden would arrive 5 minutes late, disrupting whatever lesson was in progress. He'd make comments about women's inability to understand complex mathematics, always delivered with a smile that suggested he was just joking. He'd challenge Victoria's solutions on the board, not because he understood the material better, but because questioning her authority entertained his audience. "My dad says female teachers usually stick to elementary school," he'd announced during week 3, loud enough for the entire class to hear. Something about how women's brains work differently with numbers. The comment had been followed by his signature smirk, the one that suggested he was too charming to be held accountable for his words. Victoria had continued teaching, marking down another entry in the notebook where she documented every incident: date, time, witnesses, exact quotes, building a paper trail that she hoped would never be necessary. But her boxing background had taught her to always be prepared for the fight you didn't want to have. The real revelation had come during week 4, when Victoria discovered what was really happening in her classroom. While grading quizzes one evening, she'd noticed something that made her blood run cold. Braden's answers were wrong, not just incorrect, but fundamentally confused. His understanding of basic calculus concepts was non-existent, yet his official transcript showed 3 years of straight A's in advanced mathematics. A little digging had revealed the scope of the problem. Braden wasn't just failing her class. He was academically ineligible for athletic participation under state regulations. His entire academic record was a carefully constructed lie, propped up by grades that had been changed, assignments that had been completed by others, and tests that had been taken with unauthorized assistance. The grade manipulation scheme involved at least 47 student-athletes over 3 years, representing millions of dollars in fraudulent scholarships and recruiting violations. College coaches had been making scholarship offers based on fabricated academic achievements, while the real students struggled in remedial courses that didn't appear on official transcripts. Victoria had spent her evenings building a case, documenting the evidence with the same methodical precision she'd once used to study her boxing opponents. Bank records showing suspicious payments to school personnel, email chains discussing grade modifications, security footage of students leaving campus during exams they'd supposedly taken. It was a conspiracy that reached from the classroom to the school board, with everyone taking their cut of the athletic revenue stream. But she'd needed more time to gather evidence, which meant enduring Braden's escalating harassment while pretending to be just another naive substitute teacher who didn't understand how things worked at Pinewood High. The harassment had intensified during week 5, when Braden realized that Victoria wasn't backing down or modifying his grades. He'd started filming her during class, claiming he was documenting her teaching methods for his parents to review. His phone would appear whenever she made a mistake or stumbled over a word, capturing moments of human imperfection to be edited into humiliating social media content. My followers love watching teachers try to act smart, he'd told her after class one afternoon, scrolling through comments on his latest video. You're actually pretty popular. They call you Math Lady Meltdown now. Victoria had maintained her professional composure, even as she fantasized about showing Braden exactly what kind of meltdown a three-time Golden Gloves champion could deliver. Her left hand had clenched involuntarily, muscle memory from countless hours in the ring responding to the threat in his voice. But she'd kept her hands in her pockets and her voice steady. I'm glad my students are engaged with the material, she'd replied. Education should be interactive. The comment had clearly frustrated him, robbing him of the emotional reaction he'd been fishing for. Victoria had learned long ago that bullies fed on fear and anger, starved them of both, and they usually moved on to easier targets. But Braden Cross wasn't just any bully. He was a narcissist, watching his perfect world crack apart. And that made him exponentially more dangerous. Week 6 had brought a new level of psychological warfare. Braden had started questioning Victoria's qualifications in front of visiting parents, suggesting that Pinewood deserved better than a temporary hire who probably couldn't get a real teaching job. He'd spread rumors about her personal life, creating elaborate stories about why a woman her age was still single and working as a substitute teacher. I heard she got fired from her last school for having anger management issues, he'd told Mason Wheeler during a conversation meant to be overheard. My dad knows people who check these things, said she's got some kind of violent history. The irony hadn't been lost on Victoria. Her violent history consisted of being too good at boxing, too aggressive in the ring, too willing to hurt opponents who couldn't protect themselves. She'd quit the sport because she was afraid of what she might do to someone who couldn't fight back. And now she was being tormented by exactly that kind of person. But the real breaking point had come on Tuesday morning of Week 7, when Dr. Steinberg had called Victoria into his office for what he'd termed a performance review. The meeting had been a masterclass in administrative intimidation, delivered with the kind of practiced authority that comes from years of protecting the wrong people. I've been receiving some concerns about your teaching methods, Dr. Steinberg had begun, not bothering to look up from his computer screen. Some of our more prominent families feel that you might not be the right fit for Pinewood's academic environment. Victoria had sat quietly while he outlined the complaints. She was too rigid in her grading, too unwilling to accommodate the unique circumstances of student-athletes, too focused on academic standards that didn't reflect the realities of competitive sports. The subtext had been clear. Either she started playing ball, or she'd be looking for another job. I understand that you're new to our community, Dr. Steinberg had continued, finally making eye contact with the expression of a man accustomed to getting his way. But Pinewood has traditions that go back generations. Football is more than just a sport here. It's a pathway to success for young men who might not otherwise have college opportunities. Sometimes we need to be flexible in how we measure achievement. Victoria had nodded politely, while calculating exactly how much evidence she'd need to bring down his entire operation. The meeting hadn't been about her teaching. It had been a threat delivered with administrative politeness. Modify Braden's grades. Keep quiet about the fraud, or face consequences that would extend far beyond Pinewood High. I appreciate your guidance, she'd replied with manufactured sincerity. I'm always willing to learn new approaches to education. But even as she'd spoken the words, Victoria had been planning her next move. The corruption wasn't just about grades. It was about a system that protected perpetrators while silencing victims, that prioritized athletic revenue over academic integrity, that taught young men like Braden Cross that rules didn't apply to them as long as they could throw a football. Thursday morning had arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually made Victoria optimistic about the day ahead. She'd spent the previous evening organizing her evidence, preparing copies of bank records, email chains, and grade modification documents that would expose the entire conspiracy. Her plan was simple: gather one more piece of irrefutable proof. Then contact the state education department with everything she'd discovered. But Braden Cross had his own plans for Thursday morning. Victoria's first hint of trouble had come when she'd walked into her AP Calculus classroom to find 15 adults scattered among the student desks. Parent Observation Day, an event that Dr. Steinberg had somehow forgotten to mention during their previous day's meeting. The adults were Pinewood's elite, oil executives, law firm partners, medical specialists, and other members of the community whose children attended the state's most expensive public school. Braden had been holding court in his usual back row seat, regaling the audience with stories about his latest recruiting visits and scholarship offers. His parents sat nearby, Mayor Patricia Cross and her husband Daniel, a petroleum executive whose company had donated the school's new athletic complex. They'd been beaming with pride as their son described his upcoming visit to Stanford University, where he'd supposedly been offered a full academic scholarship based on his perfect grades and test scores. Victoria had recognized the setup immediately. This wasn't a random parent observation. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to humiliate her in front of Pinewood's power structure. Braden would challenge her authority with adult witnesses present, forcing her to either back down publicly or risk her job by standing firm. "Good morning, everyone," Victoria had said, setting her materials on the desk with deliberate calm. "I'm excited to have you join us for today's lesson on integration by substitution. It's one of the more challenging concepts in calculus, but I'm confident our students are ready for the challenge." She'd begun writing the day's problem on the whiteboard, a complex integration that required multiple steps and careful attention to detail. Behind her, she could hear Braden whispering to his friends, building anticipation for whatever stunt he'd planned. "Actually, Ms. Hayes," Braden had interrupted, his voice carrying the false politeness he'd perfected for adult audiences. "I think there might be an error in your setup. That's not how we learned integration in our previous classes." Victoria had turned to face him, meeting his challenge with the same calm she'd once brought to the boxing ring. "Would you like to explain what you think the error is?" "Well," Braden had continued, standing up to address both Victoria and the parent audience, "my understanding is that you should use the power rule first. Then apply the substitution method. The way you're doing it seems backwards." The statement had been complete nonsense, revealing that Braden understood neither the power rule nor substitution methods. But he'd delivered it with such confidence that several parents had turned to Victoria with expressions of concern, wondering if their children were being taught incorrect methods by an underqualified substitute teacher. Victoria had felt the familiar calm settling over her, the same focus that had carried her through 3 Golden Gloves tournaments. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, when all of Braden's harassment had been leading toward this public confrontation. He was trying to destroy her credibility in front of witnesses, using his reputation and family connections to override mathematical facts. "That's an interesting perspective," Victoria had replied, moving to a clean section of the whiteboard. "Why don't you come up and show us how you would solve this problem using your method?" The invitation had been delivered with professional courtesy, but Victoria had seen the flash of panic in Braden's eyes. He'd expected her to either accept his criticism or argue with him, not challenge him to demonstrate his supposed expertise in front of his parents and their friends. "I don't think I need to prove myself to you," Braden had replied. his confidence beginning to waver. "Everyone here knows my academic record." "Of course," Victoria had agreed, pulling up Braden's official transcript on her laptop and projecting it onto the classroom screen. "Let's take a look at that record." What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times, analyzed by education experts and legal professionals, and cited in congressional hearings about academic fraud in public schools. Because Victoria Hayes hadn't just exposed one student's fake grades, she'd revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Texas high school athletics. "According to your official transcript," Victoria had announced, scrolling through Braden's academic history, "you've maintained a 4.0 GPA in advanced mathematics for 3 years. That would suggest mastery of algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and pre-calculus." She'd clicked to a new screen, showing Braden's actual performance in her class. "However, your work in my calculus course suggests significant gaps in understanding of basic mathematical concepts. Your last quiz score was 18%, and your homework completion rate is 32%. The room had gone silent as parents processed what they were seeing. Braden's perfect academic record didn't match his actual mathematical ability, suggesting either a sudden cognitive decline or systematic grade manipulation. "But here's where it gets really interesting," Victoria had continued, pulling up bank records that she'd spent weeks analyzing. "These financial documents show unusual payments from the Pinewood Athletic Booster Club to various school personnel over the past 3 years. Payments that correspond exactly with grade modification dates in the student information system." The projection screen had filled with evidence, bank statements, email chains, and security footage that painted a picture of comprehensive academic fraud. 47 student athletes had received inflated grades in exchange for athletic success, while the real students struggled with material they'd never been properly taught. Mayor Cross had stood up abruptly, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "This is inappropriate and potentially illegal. You have no right to access private financial information or make these accusations in front of parents." "Actually," Victoria had replied, clicking to a new document, "I have every right to report suspected fraud to appropriate authorities. These documents have already been shared with the Texas Education Agency, the NCAA Compliance Office, and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division." The statement had hit the room like a physical blow. Parents had begun whispering urgently among themselves, calculating how this scandal might affect their own children's college prospects. Dr. Steinberg had appeared in the doorway, his face pale as he realized that his carefully constructed system was collapsing in real time. But it was Braden's reaction that had truly shocked everyone. Instead of embarrassment or contrition, his face had contorted with pure rage. The Golden Boy facade had cracked completely, revealing the entitled narcissist underneath who'd never been told no by anyone in his entire life. "You fucking bitch!" he'd snarled, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the classroom. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You just destroyed my life." And the profanity in front of parents and teachers had sent another shockwave through the room. But Victoria had recognized something more dangerous in his expression. This wasn't just anger. It was the kind of rage that preceded violence. Her boxing instincts had kicked in automatically, cataloging exits, assessing threats, preparing for the fight that was about to begin. "Braden, sit down," Dr. Steinberg had commanded from the doorway, but his authority had evaporated along with the athletic program's credibility. "No!" Braden had screamed, moving toward Victoria with his fists clenched. "This bitch thinks she can come into our school and destroy everything we've built? I don't think so." Victoria had shifted her weight slightly, moving into the balanced stance that had won her 3 Golden Gloves championships. After 47 days of restraint, after weeks of documentation and professional behavior, after years of trying to forget what she was capable of in a fight, the moment had finally arrived when talking would stop and action would begin. The room had held its breath as Braden Cross, mayor's son, star quarterback, and poster child for athletic privilege, discovered that some people fight back. And as his fist swung toward Victoria's face, 31 witnesses with smartphones would capture every second of what happened when a former boxing champion finally stopped holding back. The first punch came faster than most people could follow, but Victoria Hayes had been watching Braden Cross's shoulders for the telltale tension that preceded violent action. In boxing, fights are won in the milliseconds before contact, when superior training meets uncontrolled aggression. Braden's haymaker swing carried all the fury of his shattered world, but none of the technique needed to land it effectively. Victoria slipped the punch with minimal movement, letting his fist pass harmlessly over her right shoulder while she pivoted on her back foot. The motion was so fluid that several parents later claimed she'd barely moved. But every phone camera in the room captured the moment when Pinewood High's golden boy swung at empty air and stumbled forward off balance. "Braden, stop!" Mayor Cross had screamed from her seat, but her son was beyond hearing rational commands. The public exposure of his fraudulent grades had triggered something primal, a desperate need to reassert dominance through the only method he understood. Jackson Riley had jumped up from his desk, moving to flank Victoria from her left side. At 6'4" and 230 pounds, the linebacker assumed his size advantage would intimidate the math teacher into submission. He'd spent 4 years using physical presence to solve problems that his limited intellect couldn't handle, and he saw no reason why this situation should be different. "Back off, lady," Jackson had growled, stepping close enough that Victoria could smell the protein powder on his breath. "You don't know who you're messing with." Victoria's response had been education in motion. Her left hand shot out in a perfect jab, connecting with Jackson's solar plexus with surgical precision. The punch carried just enough force to double him over, while a follow-up knee strike to his thigh sent him crashing into the nearest desk. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, demonstrating the difference between trained technique and athletic intimidation. Mason Wheeler had frozen mid-rise from his chair, suddenly reconsidering his involvement as he watched his much larger teammate writhing on the floor. The basketball captain possessed enough intelligence to recognize when a situation had moved beyond his comfort zone, and the sight of Victoria Hayes standing perfectly balanced while Jackson gasped for air had definitely crossed that threshold. But Braden Cross had passed the point of rational calculation. His entire identity was collapsing in real time, watched by parents who controlled Pinewood's social hierarchy and filmed by classmates who would upload his humiliation to social media within minutes. The athletic scholarship offers would evaporate, the college acceptance letters would be rescinded, and the golden future that everyone had promised him would disappear like smoke. "You think you're so fucking smart," he'd snarled, charging forward with another wild swing. "Let's see how smart you are when I knock your teeth out." This time, Victoria didn't just slip the punch. She countered with the kind of combination that had made her legendary in Texas amateur boxing circles. A sharp left hook to Braden's ribs folded him slightly, creating the perfect opening for an uppercut that snapped his head back and sent him stumbling toward the whiteboard. Blood had begun flowing from his split lip, the first crimson drops that would stain Pinewood High's reputation permanently. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the psychological destruction of watching their untouchable quarterback get systematically dismantled by a substitute teacher who weighed 60 pounds less than him. Jesus Christ, Daniel Cross had whispered from the back of the room, watching his son discover that money and privilege couldn't overcome basic physics. She's destroying him. Dr. Steinberg had finally found his voice, though his authority had already evaporated along with his administrative credibility. Ms. Hayes, stop this immediately. This is assault. Victoria had paused, her hands raised in a defensive position while Braden struggled to regain his footing. This is self-defense against multiple attackers who threatened me with physical violence. Everything is being recorded by witnesses who can verify that I used minimal force to protect myself. The legal distinction had been delivered with the calm precision of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. Victoria knew that her actions would be scrutinized by attorneys, education officials, and media commentators, and she'd made sure that every move was justifiable under Texas self-defense statutes. But Braden hadn't finished learning his lesson yet. Pride and desperation had combined into a toxic cocktail that overrode any survival instincts he might have possessed. He'd wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, leaving a red smear across his perfect features that would dominate social media feeds for weeks. "This isn't over," he'd gasped, moving toward Victoria again with the determined stupidity of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "My father will have your job. We'll sue you for everything you're worth. You'll never teach again." "Your father," Victoria had replied, settling into the boxing stance that had carried her through 3 Golden Gloves tournaments, "is about to be very busy with federal investigators, along with Dr. Steinberg, Athletic Director Morrison, and about 12 other people who thought they were too important to get caught." The statement had sent another shockwave through the parent audience, many of whom were calculating their own exposure to the expanding scandal. Bank records didn't lie, and Victoria's evidence showed payments that touched multiple families and school board members. Braden's final charge had been pure desperation, a wild rush that demonstrated why football players rarely succeeded in actual fights. Victoria had sidestepped his attack, grabbed his extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the projection screen that still displayed evidence of his academic fraud. The impact had been thunderous, metal and plastic scattering across the floor while Braden lay stunned among the wreckage of his fake achievements. But it was the silence that followed that truly marked the end of an era at Pinewood High School. 31 witnesses with smartphones had captured every second of the confrontation, creating an uneditable record of what happened when institutional bullying met individual resistance. The footage would be analyzed by legal experts, studied by education researchers, and viewed millions of times by people who understood the deeper symbolism of a corrupt system being knocked unconscious by someone who refused to stay silent. The next 24 hours had brought consequences that rippled far beyond Pinewood's manicured campus. FBI agents had arrived by 10 a.m., executing search warrants for financial records and computer systems. Dr. Steinberg had been arrested in his office, handcuffed in front of students and teachers who'd watched him enable corruption for years. Athletic Director Morrison had tried to flee to Mexico, only to be apprehended at Houston Intercontinental Airport with 2 suitcases full of cash and documents. Mayor Patricia Cross had resigned by noon, citing personal reasons, while her husband's petroleum company faced federal investigation for its role in the bribery scheme. The Pinewood School Board had called an emergency meeting for Friday evening, where they would vote to terminate 15 employees and implement new oversight procedures that should have existed decades earlier. But it was the student response that had truly surprised everyone. Instead of rallying around their fallen quarterback, Pinewood's students had embraced Victoria as a hero who had finally exposed the toxic culture that had oppressed them for years. The academic students who'd been marginalized by athletic favoritism, the female athletes who'd received minimal support compared to football players, and the minority students who had been systematically excluded from opportunities all found their voices in the aftermath of Braden's defeat. Sophia Martinez, a senior who'd been denied National Merit Scholar recognition because her perfect test scores didn't fit Pinewood's athletic narrative, had organized a student protest demanding academic integrity. For 4 years, we've watched cheaters get rewarded while honest students got ignored, she'd told news reporters camped outside the school. Ms. Hayes showed us that one person can make a difference if they're willing to fight for what's right. The viral spread of the classroom footage had transformed Victoria from an unknown substitute teacher into a national symbol of resistance against institutional corruption. Math teacher fight had trending on social media for 3 days, while education experts used the incident to discuss broader problems with athletic privilege in American schools. Cable news networks had competed for exclusive interviews, offering Victoria book deals and speaking opportunities that could have made her wealthy. But she'd declined most requests, focusing instead on testifying before congressional committees investigating corruption in public education. Her measured testimony about grade manipulation and financial fraud had led to federal legislation requiring independent oversight of athletic programs at schools receiving federal funding. The personal transformations had been equally dramatic. Jackson Riley had transferred to a school where he'd have to earn his grades honestly, discovering that academic achievement required effort he'd never been asked to provide. The experience had been humbling but ultimately beneficial, teaching him that success without merit was just delayed failure. Mason Wheeler had found his conscience during the investigation, providing testimony that helped prosecutors understand the full scope of the conspiracy. His cooperation had earned him immunity from criminal charges, though he'd lost his basketball scholarship and spent the following year in community college rebuilding his academic credentials through legitimate effort. But it was Braden Cross's journey that had provided the most compelling evidence that people could change when confronted with real consequences. The former Golden Boy had spent 2 weeks in juvenile detention after being charged with assault, where he'd encountered peers who didn't care about his family connections or football statistics. The experience had shattered his narcissistic worldview, forcing him to confront the reality that his actions affected other people in ways he'd never considered. Court-mandated therapy had revealed the psychological pressure that had driven his bullying behavior, years of being told that his worth depended on athletic achievement and social dominance. I spent my whole life thinking I was special because everyone told me I was special, Braden had said during his public apology 6 months later. I never learned how to fail, how to struggle, how to treat people with respect when I wasn't getting something from them. Ms. Hayes didn't just beat me up. She forced me to grow up. His rehabilitation had included community service at a women's shelter, where he'd learned about domestic violence and the long-term effects of intimidation. The work had been difficult and emotionally challenging, but it had given him perspective on how his behavior had affected classmates who couldn't fight back. Braden had eventually earned admission to a state university based on legitimate grades and genuine effort, though he'd never played football again. Instead, he'd studied education and psychology, preparing for a career helping other students who struggled with the pressures that had nearly destroyed him. Victoria's own transformation had been equally significant. The woman who'd quit boxing because she was afraid of hurting people had learned that sometimes violence was necessary to stop greater violence. Her classroom confrontation had sparked a national conversation about educator safety, leading to self-defense training programs and stronger protections for teachers who reported misconduct. She'd accepted a permanent position at Pinewood High, but with conditions that included curriculum autonomy and administrative support for academic integrity initiatives. Her classroom had become a model for engaging teaching methods, where students learned mathematics through real-world applications that included analyzing statistical fraud and financial corruption. The broader impact had extended far beyond Texas education. Victoria's story had inspired educators across the country to document and report misconduct they'd previously endured in silence. Attorney Sarah Martinez's law firm had received over 800 calls from teachers facing similar harassment, leading to investigations that exposed corruption in dozens of school districts. Federal education policy had changed as well, with new requirements for independent oversight of athletic programs and stronger protections for whistleblowers. The Victoria Hayes Act, signed into law 18 months after the Pinewood incident, required schools to maintain transparent academic records and prohibited retaliation against employees who reported fraud. College recruitment had been reformed through NCAA regulations that required independent verification of academic achievements, ending the era when athletic ability could override academic requirements. The changes had been controversial among sports boosters, but they'd resulted in higher graduation rates and more legitimate educational outcomes for student athletes. Victoria had addressed the National Education Association's annual conference, speaking to 15,000 educators about the importance of institutional courage. "We teach our students that knowledge is power," she'd told the audience, "but we forget that using that power requires courage. Every classroom has a Braden Cross and a Victoria Hayes. The question is which story we choose to tell." Her book, Silent No More Fighting Institutional Bullying in American Schools, had become required reading in education graduate programs across the country. The royalties had funded scholarships for students from low-income families, ensuring that economic status couldn't determine educational opportunity. But perhaps the most important change had been cultural. The Pinewood incident had demonstrated that individuals could challenge corrupt systems and win, inspiring similar acts of resistance in schools, workplaces, and communities nationwide. The phrase, "Don't be silent, be strategic," had become a rallying cry for people facing institutional intimidation. Standing in her new classroom 3 years later, Victoria often reflected on that October morning when she'd finally stopped holding back. The walls were covered with thank you letters from students who'd found their voices, photographs from speaking engagements across the country, and newspaper clippings about policy changes that had grown from her decision to fight back. The most meaningful display was a simple frame containing Braden Cross's handwritten apology letter, where he'd acknowledged the harm he'd caused and committed to spending his life making amends. His transformation from entitled bully to empowered advocate proved that even the most damaged people could change when faced with authentic consequences and genuine support. As she prepared for another day of teaching, Victoria thought about the countless students who were sitting in classrooms right now, watching injustice unfold and wondering if they should speak up or stay silent. Her story had become their permission to choose courage over compliance, to document rather than endure, and to remember that sometimes the most important lessons aren't found in textbooks. Every classroom has a Braden and a Victoria, she'd learned. The question isn't whether bullying will occur, but how we respond when it does. Silence might feel safer in the moment, but it's actually permission for the behavior to continue and escalate. If this story reminded you of your own school experience, maybe those memories aren't just personal history. Maybe they're meant to be shared with someone who's sitting in their own classroom right now, wondering if they're alone in what they're facing. Because the next Victoria Hayes might be reading these words, gathering courage from knowing that one person really can make a difference when they refuse to let injustice stand unchallenged. The blood on that classroom floor had marked more than the end of one bully's reign of terror. It had marked the beginning of a movement that proved institutional change starts with individual courage, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons are taught not with words, but with the willingness to stand up and fight back when fighting back is the only option left. 3 years later, Victoria still received messages from teachers, students, and parents who'd found their own strength in her story. They'd stood up to corrupt administrators, challenged unfair policies, and refused to let intimidation silence their voices. Each victory had rippled outward, creating waves of change that touched countless lives across the country. The mathematics were simple. One person willing to document truth and demand justice could exponentially multiply into thousands of people refusing to accept the unacceptable. If Victoria's story resonates with something you've experienced or witnessed, perhaps it's time those experiences moved from memory into action. Because somewhere right now, someone is counting days like Victoria once did, waiting for permission to stop being silent and start being powerful.